Welcome everybody to the rules clarification and occasional tips video for Solo Champions League round 703, which is a bunch of basic powerhouses versus risky business and Hydra patrol. Today I'm going to cover a bunch of rules related to the mechanism of having a dual-sided villain. Going to give a little bit of a brief reminder about what happens with or effects on encounter cards, and talk about Cosmo and the interaction with the Invocation deck. I'd also like to thank Graceclaw for sending me a few rules questions that he suggested I should discuss. So let's take it away. All right, so first up, I want to talk about what happens when you defeat Stage 1 of Green Goblin. At the start of the game, you have Norman Osborne in play, and you have Criminal Enterprise up with two of these infamy counters. When you do damage to Norman Osborne, you then cause him to flip over to Green Goblin. So you won't defeat Norman Osborne to go on to Stage 2. You'll have to defeat Green Goblin. And so when you defeat Green Goblin, you actually go to Green Goblin Stage 2. And this is coming from the actual rules insert that comes with the scenario. The way it's written, it implies that if you defeated Norman Osborne 1, you would actually go to Norman Osborne 2, but I'm not sure how that would happen. So it's really just about this Green Goblin 1 to Green Goblin 2. The next rule I wanted to look at is when you actually flip Green Goblin, or when revealed. So when you go from Norman Osborne to Green Goblin, you get this when revealed effect, and it deals 3 indirect damage to each player in hero form. Now this is really important because if you're actually able to flip Green Goblin over, so you do those 2 damage and flip Norman Osborne over to Green Goblin while you're still an alter ego, you won't take this 3 indirect damage. And that's not true for Stage 2. So when you actually advance to Stage 2, you'll get your when revealed effect, which is just deal 4 indirect damage to each player. I'll talk more about indirect damage in a moment. But it doesn't matter which side you're on, you're still going to take that 4 indirect damage when you're on Stage 2, but when you're flipping Norman Osborne Stage 1 to Green Goblin Stage 1, you only take the damage if you're in hero form. And this brings up some allies. We only have access to these basic allies plus whatever's in your actual hero's kit. But there are, 5 different allies that could be on the board before you actually flip to hero in the first turn if you want to flip Norman Osborne that early. Maybe people playing Iron Man might not do that, but there's a handful of them, so that's a thing that can be worth allowing you to avoid taking those 3 damage. On the subject of indirect damage, I want to talk about the indirect damage interaction with the tough status. So if I was to flip to Green Goblin 2 or advance to Green Goblin 2 and have to apply his 4 indirect damage to each player, right? As the player, I get to decide how that damage gets distributed. The rule is you're not allowed to apply more damage to an ally or your identity or whatever it is beyond how much damage would actually defeat it. So Lockjaw here, I couldn't put 3 of those damage on Lockjaw and then just let Lockjaw take all the damage and go to the discard pile. Similarly, even if you have a tough status card, and we'll talk about the actual interaction with tough, but I couldn't apply more than 2 damage to Ironheart because that would be beyond what is needed to defeat her. So here, with my 4 indirect damage to each player, I could go 2 to Ironheart, 2 to Lockjaw, or 2 to Ironheart, 2 to Quicksilver, or whatever I wanted, because all of that would be not beyond what would defeat them. But then there's the interaction with actual tough, and in the interaction with tough, those 2 damage would interact with the tough card as one single packet of damage. They would all hit the tough, and the tough would go away, and Ironheart would actually take no damage. And then that other 2 damage that I applied to Quicksilver or Lockjaw would get applied to them. Next up is how stunned and confused status cards interact with the villain. So Norman Osborne, normally if he goes to attack, that instead of attacking, you place an infamy counter on Criminal Enterprise. However, if he has a stun card, right, when you go to attack, the attack never happens. Instead, it gets replaced by stunned, and the stun gets discarded. Now, this check actually happens before the forced interrupt. The checking for these replacement effects is the very first thing that happens when a villain activation goes to happen. So the stun gets discarded, the forced interrupt never happens, and you move on. The next thing I wanted to look at is what happens when you do excess damage to Norman Osborne. So if you do enough damage to actually flip, right? So every time you do a damage, you lose one of these counters on Criminal Enterprise. But if you do more damage, so you flip Norman Osborne, the ruling is that it's a packet of damage, so all the damage is done, the excess damage is wasted, and then you flip Norman Osborne over to Green Goblin. So the next thing to discuss is something that is actually in the FAQ for the most recent 1.4 version of the rules. And this is the question of what happens when Green Goblin attacks. You flip over the boost card, and that boost card would cause you to remove one madness counter from State of Madness, which would take this down to 0. That would force you to flip over to Norman Osborne. And so what happens in that sequence? And the rules kind of discuss that when that happens, the attack has now actually been initiated, right? That's why you flip over the boost card. So you flip over the boost card, take your State of Madness down to 0, flip over to Norman Osborne, add your 2 counters to Criminal Enterprise. However, you are already past the point at which this forced interrupt of when Norman Osborne would attack. This has already been checked at the point when Green Goblin attacked, and you flipped this over. So this thing does not actually resolve, this forced interrupt, and instead Norman Osborne has 0 attack plus 0 from the boost card, and you take no damage. So Norman Osborne has actually attacked you for 0, and you take no damage. The replacement effect doesn't happen. I wanted to look at as well these OR cards. So we have a bunch of examples of OR cards in counters. This boost here is sort of an OR, right? It's not stated as an OR, but place 1 infamy counter on Criminal Enterprise. If you cannot, remove 1 madness counter from State of Madness. Hired Gun is different, and it says choose to either give the villain 1 face-down boost card or place 2 infamy counters on Criminal Enterprise. However, if you're not actually on Criminal Enterprise at the time because of the state of the villain, you cannot make that choice, so you have to choose to give the villain 1 face-down boost card. So when you have these choices, you have to make the choice that would actually result in a change in game state. Although this is not the right example, if one of the things is you have to pay a certain number of resources and you cannot actually pay all of those, there are some rules about doing partial ones as well, but we won't discuss that any further here. Anyway, all of this is very similar to what happens with obligations. If Steve Rogers is already exhausted when I get this obligation, I cannot choose the first bullet of exhausting Steve Rogers. I must take the second one because that is the one that would actually change the game state, right? So this is in the case where I'm already exhausted. Choosing to exhaust Steve Rogers would not change the game state, so I can't make that choice. I need to make the second bullet. Finally, I wanted to discuss Cosmo and the interaction with the Invocation deck. So the ruling is that Cosmo can actually use his effect. So when he attacks or thwarts, you name a card type, then discard the top card of a deck. And this works for Crossbones weapon deck and a bunch of other decks, but it also works for Doctor Strange's Invocation deck. Now, everything in here is actually an event, which is awesome. And this means I can say, well, I'm going to name an event card, and then I'm going to flip over the card. Now, the way Doctor Strange's deck plays, you actually know what the top card is anyway, but what this allows you to do is actually purposely cycle a card to get to the next card in the deck. So Cosmo is another way of cycling your Invocation deck, just like Wong is. So I want to thank everybody for watching the video. Hopefully I gave you a couple tips and made some rules clarifications that were helpful, and we will see you in the next round.